Hello. I'm very sorry I'm not able to be with you. I hope in this format I still will be able to contribute something to this conversation. I'm interested in trying to open up this exploration because it opens up to decolonization. Decolonization is not a policy advocated by any political actor with access to mainstream political space in a place like the United States. And so decolonization points to the limits of state-centered politics and even state-targeted resistance, and to the promise of thinking about other politics, other kinds of rights, other kinds of commons, other ways of living together, other futures. And I think it's precisely for this reason that because decolonization opens up to other futures is why indigenous knowledge, colonial studies, the politics of decolonization are so distant from discourses around architecture and the city, because, of course, architecture and the city are so enmeshed in colonial structures of power and property and labor. And so what I have to offer here today is one very brief gesture towards a way to open architecture and urbanism towards a politics of decolonization. Okay, next image, please. Thank you. A few years ago, just as community activists in Detroit were critiquing gentrification as colonization, a vast 45-block development near downtown Detroit, branded the district open for business. And this development was anchored by a building called Little Caesars Arena, which is a new stadium for Detroit's professional hockey and basketball teams. Next slide, please. Among the amenities on offer in Little Caesars Arena is the 1701 pub. And this pub is named for the year when the French explorer Antoine Cadillac established a trading post and a fort at the place where the city of Detroit would subsequently develop. Next slide, please. And you see here a map and a plaque outside the 1701 pub, which is describing in word and image both how the city of Detroit was founded in 1701 by European settlers and quickly became one of the industrial powerhouses of North America. So at this pub, Detroit's present is enmeshed in Detroit's colonial past. I think it's possible to say that in the frame of traditional critical theory, this enmeshment would appear within the sphere of ideology. It would be a kind of ideological framing of contemporary urban development and its displacements, in its inequities, its violence, in a long and venerable history. I think this enmeshment of Detroit's colonial past and its present opens towards something else as well, which is the way in which the urban history of cities in the United States can be understood as a history of land seizures, a history of dispossessions, a history of displacements that repeatedly reprise US colonial settlement and maintains what I would call a kind of continuous colonial present. And that's what I want to try to briefly gesture towards in what's to come. That next slide, please. Detroit took form on the traditional territories of the Three Fires people, the Ojibwe, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi, in a place that was known as Waawiyaataanong in the Anishinaabeg language that was spoken by many of the people who traversed and inhabited and sustained this place. Waawiyaataanong, which means in Anishinaabeg where the waters go around, was a place where what is now called the Detroit River narrowed and became easier to cross. Next image. And this was the place, Waawiyaataanong, was where the French explorer Cadillac located his fort in 1701 and where the city of Detroit subsequently developed. The site of Detroit was acquired by the United States by treaty with a group of tribes in 1807, and the city developed through the 19th century as the US government acquired the territory of what became the state of Michigan by a series of other treaties and the consequent displacement of indigenous people who inhabited that territory. And the next map, please. This is a map of Detroit from 1873, and it shows a series of long and parallel lines that define streets and blocks and districts. And these are all lines that emerged in 18th century colonialism. Next image. When long and narrow ribbon farms were laid out perpendicular to the Detroit River so that each farmer had access to the river. This is what these maps show. So next slide. The district outlined in red here was originally one of those farms, and it became in the next century a neighborhood called the Cass Corridor. It's a neighborhood that developed along a street called Cass Avenue in the late 19th century. The next image. This was originally a neighborhood inhabited by elite white Detroiters just north of downtown Detroit. The next image. In the early 20th century, when Detroit began to rapidly urbanize, and this was a process that you can see from this cartoon was sometimes understood in relationship to settler colonialism. The next image. During this urbanization, affluent white families moved to neighborhoods further from downtown, and then rooming houses, multifamily houses, and businesses increasingly were located in the Cass Corridor. Next image. After World War II, working class Black communities who were dispossessed in urban renewal often relocated to the Cass Corridor, along with many other marginalized communities, including, next image, Native Americans who had been forced off reservations in the West into urban areas in the Midwest in the wake of the US government's 1956 Relocation Act. And this led to the Cass Corridor being nicknamed a red ghetto, which is what you can see here. Next image. But by the 1970s, the Cass Corridor was one of the most racially diverse, culturally vibrant, politically active, and economically disadvantaged neighborhoods in the city. Next image. Which was a set of features that prompted corporate and municipal disinvestment. The next image. And corresponding to that disinvestment, the city began to locate a number of social service providers in the Cass Corridor, which further drove down property values and contributed to the area's impoverishment. Next image. And then in the wake of this, the Cass Corridor then began to appear as a real estate frontier. And that word, I think, is very telling. And so it became a site where both private and public land was targeted for investment, which functioned as both a cause and a cover term for resettlement. Next image. The largest investment was made by a consortium of companies owned by a billionaire family who founded and owned a national pizza franchise called Little Caesars Pizza, and who became one of the major protagonists in real estate development in Detroit. And I think I want to focus on two aspects of that development, because I think these aspects testify to the contemporaneity of settler colonialism in Detroit. First, the rendering of the enclosure of collectively held assets, including public property, as improvements. And second, the rendering of resettlement as settlement. Next slide. Let's go to the next slide. So first, how the enclosure of collectively held assets becomes a phenomenon that could be understood as an improvement. The seizure of indigenous land in the context of settler colonialism was accomplished by, among many other things, law underwritten by philosophy, and most prominently, perhaps, John Locke's labor theory of property, which is probably familiar to many of the people in this room. Locke's theory assigned the right of ownership, not to those who inhabited land or cared for land or identified with land, but to those who could combine their labor with land so that the land would be used in what Locke called the most industrious and rational manner. And Locke understood industrious and rational land use in relationship to capital-based productivity, the use of land to raise crops, the use of land to graze livestock, to mine natural resources, and so on. So in other words, productivity was determined by the race and class-based structures through which capital circulated. Next image. And it's this understanding of property rights, this labor theory of property that shaped the work and thought of the framers of the U.S. Constitution and subsequent U.S. laws and policies regarding the possession of property, so that in the United States, a public use justifies the governmental exercise of eminent domain, or the capacity of the government to transfer public property and private property to private owners who can supposedly productively develop that property. In other words, it's tying the right of property to the capacity to use that property productively, which has served to legitimize land transfers for the accumulation of surplus value, and all of this being framed as a kind of public good because it increases property values, it increases tax revenues, and so forth and so on. So just as effectively as this labor theory of property legitimized the colonial seizure of indigenous land in what Locke termed the vacant places of America. So next image. And what I want to suggest is that this is a useful frame to understand what is happening in a city like Detroit. So in the Cass Corridor, this billionaire real estate development family, the Ilitch family, deliberately created what John Locke called vacant places. And in Detroit, these are places of falling property value, places of depopulation, places of disinvestment. And they did this by surreptitiously purchasing property and leaving it unmaintained and undevelopment. And so specifically what they did is this family purchased around 70 properties over a 15-year period and didn't maintain them. And you see that this is a kind of deliberate form of de-development, which this photograph here inadvertently documented. The photographer, Camilo Vergara, thought he was documenting in this photograph a space of abandonment. The space is not abandoned. Next slide, please. This space was de-developed, or what the author of this essay calls dereliction by design. And by this kind of strategy of de-development, this neighborhood that could be posed as an urgently needed development project that deserved public subsidy, even though it was the owners of this property, through their disavowed de-development, that exacerbated the problem that this public subsidy was supposed to solve. Next image. So the public not only paid 58% of the construction costs of this new real estate development, but the public also subsidized this project with the largest land transfer in the post-tribal history of Detroit. So 39 public properties sold for $1 to this real estate development family to assemble the parcel of property to build the district. The city of Detroit itself was made possible by the enclosure of indigenous land by European and American settlers. And this was all legitimized by formal legal procedures. And what I want to suggest is that there's an enclosure of public land that enabled the district to take place that fits within and is naturalized by that history. Next image. I also want to suggest there's another dimension of this project that speaks to its settler colonial origins, which has to do with the way in which resettlement gets posed as settlement. Settlements made at the origin of settler colonialism were more precisely resettlements. They were replacements of indigenous inhabitation of land with settler inhabitation of property. And this is what the scholar Patrick Wolfe calls settler colonialism's destruction in order to replace. And next slide. Wolfe goes on to describe settler replacement not only as replacing indigenous presence, but also as continually denying indigenous absence. And so he writes, the process of replacement maintains the refractory imprint of the native counterclaim. Next image. And so the properties on the so-called desolate blocks that were seized to develop the district actually housed many of Detroit's most marginalized people and communities. And these properties included so-called unoccupied buildings, many of which were squatted by dehoused people, and occupied buildings, many of which were apartment buildings rented by working class people and disadvantaged people, and a large number of people on pensions. Next slide. The refractory imprint of the Cass Corridor's destroyed communities bears heavily on the district, this proposed real estate development. This is an area planned around Little Caesars Arena, and as you can see in this image here, it consists of what are called 4 neighborhoods defined around a series of what are called local sites. Next image. The planning consultant for all this declared that what we want is a great walkable, personable neighborhood made of as many people living their lives as possible. And what's striking here is that great walkable, personable neighborhoods occupied by working class communities of color living their lives are precisely what were destroyed to make way for their gentrified versions. And this, I think, is the contemporary version of maintaining the refractory imprint of what Patrick Wolf calls a native counterclaim. Next image. In Detroit, as in many other places, activists concerned with the dispossession that projects like Little Caesars Arena yield have turned to the right to the city as a way to articulate demands for just and equitable urban development. And for David Harvey, of course, one of the leading theorists of this right, he says, since the urban process is a major channel of surplus use, establishing democratic management over its urban development constitutes the right to the city. And Harvey says that this right needs to be claimed by the dispossessed. But this term and this argument solicits decolonization. The right to the city, of course, is a concept drawn from the work of Henri Lefebvre in post-1968 France, where dispossession did not take place on colonized land, did not take place on indigenous land. In the United States, by contrast, the commons that the dispossessed can reclaim is also indigenous land expropriated by a settler colonial state. Next image. So to recognize the ongoing state of settler colonialism is to also historicize and theorize dispossession. It's to recognize dispossession as a practice that takes specific forms in settler colonialism, even as in the course of settler colonial history in the United States, this practice has targeted a range of marginalized communities and expropriated communities along with indigenous people. Next image, please. In 1999, just as the Cass Corridor began to be de-developed to create the kind of context to build Little Caesars Arena, a columnist named Omowale Diop Ankobia, who wrote for a newspaper called the Michigan Citizen, answered a letter from one of his readers. And this reader was so happy that white people are back and rebuilding the city. And in his response to this reader, Ankobia wrote with a deep awareness of the long history of this rebuilding of the city. And he staged this so-called rebuilding of the city as nothing less than the contemporary form of settler colonial urbanism. He wrote, "It's about the land. If we never build anything on it, we should not give it away, nor should we invite enemies in to build on it. The Iroquois, the Seneca, the Ojibwe, the Mohawk, etc. did that. And where are they now? We should protect it with our lives, because our life as a people depends on it. That's what all this hullabaloo is about. The land. All the hullabaloo is about the land." And so what Nkobi is suggesting here is that if land is always available to exploit, always available to develop, it's also always available to protect and even to rematriate. And so I'd like to end with his words today. Thank you.